So, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's talk, The Things We Miss, Making a Case for Audio Description and the Wonders of the Tactile Experience. But before we start, first of all, thank you to Envision Africa for sponsoring the live webinars and making it free for you guys to attend. So, a bit about our guest, Jeremy. We have worked with Jeremy for quite a long time, and Jeremy is with the Disability Desk in Cape Town. And although Jeremy is visually impaired, he's a font of information about all matters related to disability. And Jeremy has done a number of talks for us, and they are available on our website if you would like to have access to them. So, Jeremy, if you would like to introduce yourself, we will take questions at the end. You can just type the questions into the Q&A. Over to you, Jeremy.
No, thanks, Bea, very much. And good evening, everybody. And it's good to be back. We were trying to work out if this is my third or my fourth webinar with the Learning Center. So it is a pleasure for me to speak to you this evening. My background is I am a visually impaired person. Well, actually, I'm blind. I'm visually impaired as well. I have an interesting trajectory. I was born with myopia, very poor vision, and had night blindness. And it turned out when I was in my 20s, it was finally diagnosed as RP. So it was quite an early onset. And then I had a plateaued time for some time where it didn't really deteriorate too much. But ultimately, now in my early 60s, I have almost no vision at all. It's just a bit of light and dark. And so I've had a nice trajectory of low vision into blindness to be able to draw on, which is both a blessing in the sense that I can relate to many other people's problems, which is why I love helping people who are going through that quite disturbing and traumatic trajectory of losing one's vision, particularly in the workplace. It interests me a lot. But it's also unnerving because the experience is, well, as I say, unnerving. When one moment you could see something and the next moment you couldn't. So the way I explain it is, for about 59 years, I could see the mountain here in Cape Town. And I used it as my lodestar. It was my navigational tool. And I could never see the detail on the mountain. I couldn't see the university or Rhodes Memorial or the forest or the waterfalls in winter, but I could see the outline of the mountain. And then last year it disappeared. It was like somebody stole the mountain. And it was a wrench, an absolute wrench. It was my last grip on visual reality, I reckon. And so it's a moving feast. And when I teach, one of the things that I do is I teach. I teach corporates and organizations about disability inclusion. And in that, one has to understand more about disability. And when I get to the visual part, I always try and explain to them something that most people simply cannot get. Most able-bodied people can't get, and maybe even people with disabilities, is that blindness is not a binary. It is not black and white. It is not light and dark. It is not can see and can't see. It is an incredibly complex and confusing, moving feast. And so, I mean, many of you in the audience know this, but I cannot overstate the significance of it. And it's germane to what I'm going to be talking about tonight, which is what we miss. So ostensibly, I'm going to be talking about audio description, but I'm actually talking about what we miss. And we miss it because we can't see it, but we also miss it because those with us invariably might forget to mention something that is visually apparent to them, but which is essentially invisible to us. And we go through life relying very much on what people tell us about the visual world out there. We manage many of us manage very well with our navigation abilities and our ability to move around, and we can get on that, we can do tech and we can work very well and we can do all these things. But there are many things, many of them recreational, which we simply miss out on. I'll show you an example a little later in the talk, but a particular example, and it really made me think, a couple of years ago, I was walking on Sea Point Promenade, and I was with my wife and a good friend of ours, and we're walking down the promenade. And I've been on that promenade 100 times in the last 5 years, I reckon. And my wife said, "Oh, look there, there's a chap hanging off the sunglasses." Now, just picture that. Well, think about that. There's a man hanging off the sunglasses. I thought, what on earth are you smoking? And I said, "Hey, what do you mean?" And she says, "No, no, no, you know the big sunglasses?" And I said, "Actually, no." "Oh," they said, "yeah, yeah, well, it's a huge pair of sunglasses and it's on the promenade and there's somebody climbing all over." And I said, "What? I never knew this. Take me, take me." And so that's, I'll show you something about that just now. So that's an example, and it's not malicious. It's not even careless. It's just not necessarily something that people remember to do when walking with us, when being with us, when sitting with us in some medium, which there is some visual input to mention. Oh, this is something, that is something, this is going on. By the way, look at this amazing thing. And so really that's what I'm after here I'm going to take you through a little journey. I'm not going to lecture you on the history of audio description and all the technology that's available. That's not what this is about. This is about opening your eyes to the essentials of understanding that there is a very rich universe out there that can be shared. And that if you don't, we miss it. And that's kind of sad. So essentially, it's the visual made verbal. That's the point. I often think about this, and I think of radio, the days of radio, and of course, South Africa's only had TV since '76, so we all knew radio. Those of us old enough knew radio really well, and radio was a great example of audio description. If you wanted to describe a painting, they had to do it visually or verbally, rather. And so it's interesting that we're actually not strangers to audio description. It's the funniest thing. But essentially, audio description is making things apparent to us, to share the magic of what you're seeing, which if you don't, we're simply going to lose out, which is quite, you know, if I had a rand for every time somebody said to me, I remember with inflation, perhaps I should say, if I had 10 rand for every time someone said to me, "What's audio description?" when I've mentioned audio description. Because people say, "What do you do?" And I said, "Well, I do this, I do that, and I'm really interested in audio description." And they say, "What's audio description?" And it's why I call the slide the best kept secret. So I'm mindful that there are blindies in the audience, and any picture I'll obviously be walking you through, but on the slide is just text at the moment. And I'm basically saying here, the best kept secret in town. And essentially what we're talking about here is, what do we have to use or resort to be able to get audio description other than people with us? So if somebody is with you, clearly they're going to be helping you with the audio description. But what else is there that we can use? And I use the word resort deliberately, and you'll understand just now at the end, or at the end of this particular slide. But so Netflix in South Africa was an incredible boon to the blind. Before that, there was absolutely no audio description provided in television, other than a couple of pilot episodes, which was very strongly lobbied for by Shakila Maharaj and Shazison. But that's a tiny, tiny drop in the bucket. There was a couple of vernacular Zulu language sitcoms that had been audio described by Shakila and her team. But apart from that, Netflix was quite literally the only audio description en masse. And I mean, what I find very sad is where I have to inform a blind person after how many years of Netflix now, I can't actually think of how many years we've had Netflix, 6, 7 perhaps, that in fact that there is audio description provided, because I'm telling you now, many, 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 or most sighted people have no clue that there is in fact audio description in many of the films and shows on Netflix. And you go into the menu and where you would, obviously this is something that blind people can't do other than on a phone and perhaps on your laptop if you have Netflix on it. But if it's on your TV and you're using a remote, there's no way a blind person can do it. So you go into the menu and you look at where you might find subtitles, for instance, or other languages, and there you might see audio description, which is not to be confused with audio language. It's a very different thing. So often it'll say audio English or audio Portuguese. That's not audio description. So it's important. And then, of course, if it's a European show, it's very likely that the audio description is in the original vernacular and not, in fact, in English. And so that's a bit of a drag. We actually quite like a lot of the European shows, but we can't manage the audio description in other languages. And what's interesting about Netflix and audio description is that it's by no means ubiquitous. There is definitely not every show available, and which is quite sad. And what's interesting is that even very recent shows, there are very often not audio description, which I cannot believe is the case. And so what I'm thinking is possible is that Netflix South Africa is being cavalier or lazy or just ignorant and not including the audio description track with a new movie. I cannot believe that the latest movie with Jane Fonda and Lily Tomlinson called Moving On does not have audio description in reality, and yet it doesn't have audio description on Netflix in South Africa. I mean, the movie only came out this year, so to me, it's inconceivable that it doesn't have the track. So the question would be, why not? And so there are other things other than Netflix. So Netflix is an incredible boon when you can find the audio description. Wonderful. Amazon Prime, if you have it, apparently there are many tracks on there, but I don't know many people who use that. Then there is an app. There's a wonderful facility by the local company, Shazison, which is founded by Shakila Maharaj, well-known blind person in this country, been an old friend of mine for many years. And they have an app. It's called Describe At, DESCRIBE, a capital T. And Describe At is essentially a repository of many titles that they themselves have provided audio description for. Local movies in particular, which is very powerful for the local movie industry, and also tours. And so there's several tours on there as well. But without being dismissive, it is only a tiny proportion of what there might be covered by audio description, but simply doesn't exist. So to my knowledge, that's probably the only repository of audio description in this country that I can find. And there might be others, but forgive me if I'm entirely wrong, but I don't believe I've seen anything like it. Then there's Be My Eyes, of course, which is, I mean, this is fascinating stuff. Be My Eyes is a game changer, and I'm sure I'm not alone in the audience of thinking so. It is unbelievable what it's done, and it's new, literally less than a year old, in the sense of Be My Eyes isn't new, but the new facility, the AI version, has changed my life in the sense that I used to get really irritated when people sent me pictures and didn't tell me what they were. Now I can push it through the app and have an extraordinary explanatory experience of what the picture is. But it is only an AI version, and it doesn't do justice to artwork, for instance, and it misinterprets many things, but it does an extraordinary job for photographs. Absolutely extraordinary. So it's definitely a game changer. And then, of course, there is, I flippantly in the slide, I'm saying, and you have to go to the slightly dodgy sites like Audio Vault and Three Blind Mice and others that might exist. And what those are, of course, are pirate sites. Every teenager in the world knows about pirate sites, and every teenager's people know about pirate sites, and many of us stream, whether we, conscious of the copyright infringement or not. But when it comes to the blind, it's interesting, actually, because we're probably the greatest lawbreakers of all sectors of disability, simply because we have always flirted with illegality by having to stream things like going to Audio Vault, streaming the audio track with the audio description track. So technically, it's illegal. Technically, it's copyright infringement. But what else is there? What else is there? And the blind, particularly the Braille users, have been breaking the law for generations. Every Braille transcription out there is illegal. And it's changing only very recently with the amendments being signed by the president of the particular copyright law, which will allow them now to transcribe Braille for their personal use. But anything larger than personal use is still illegal. So you've got to scratch your head here and think, oh, you're breaking the law. But, well, you know what? Tough. So if we want it badly enough, we're going to find a way to get it. So that's essentially a background. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about the applications of audio description. So obviously there's the film media, film shows, that's, particularly film and television media. Then I'll be talking about art a little bit. And then I'll be talking about the tactile experience. So that's what we're going to be doing now. So this next slide, I had in mind to play you an audio. And we've been fiddling, and it wasn't going to work in the way that I had hoped it would. And it would have meant that it would have taken time to, restart the share and everything else. And so I've chosen not to. So what I'm going to talk about here a little bit is audio description in movies is the most glorious thing when it's done well. What we're noticing is that sometimes various audio description companies aren't doing it well. And there are many varieties of audio descriptions. There are different techniques, there are different styles, and there's different quality. And that in itself is quite sad, where you'll get a perfectly good movie and a lousy audio description, which I find really unfortunate. And I know that, people have often queried the quality of audio description, and there's been quite a defensive answer. Or there is elements of the audio description that have been chosen to focus on and not focus on others. So for instance, looking at a particular movie recently, and there was a character who happened to be black, but the audio description failed to mention that. And then when queried in a forum somewhere, there was a big argument. Well, why do you need to know he's black? And well, the answer is because he's clearly black on the screen, so it's obviously a useful piece of information. So why wouldn't the blind person find it useful to know that he's black? Then there's another school of thought that says, hang on, if you're going to talk about cultural issues, you ought to have various people of that. It's like a woman describing something intimate about a man. Surely you should have a man doing that, and vice versa. So there's many styles and threads around this which are quite interesting. But I want to give you a little example, and I'm going to more or less recite here what I found to be one of the most poignant and visually, my mental vision, stimulating. So many of you may have seen a very good rendition of an outstanding book, All the Light We Cannot See. And everyone knows, of course, that the actress was blind in the television series, and it was a pretty good rendition. They as they do, it wasn't quite like the book and all that, but it was a fine show. But there was a scene at the end, in the very last, literally the last 10, 30 seconds, and the audio describer described the protagonist, the heroine, and she's now after an incredibly traumatic experience, and she finds herself on this beach, and she's clutching something, and she's going to deal with it and do something with this thing, and we know what it is. But she's had this experience, and we discover she's barefoot only because the describer has told us so. And I'll never forget the way they put it, and said, and she stood there on the edge of the water, and her feet. Now we know that she's gone through hell. She's literally gone through bomb-damaged buildings and blood and gore all over the place. And so the audio describer said she stands there, and her bloodied and dirty feet on the beach, and then the water laps over them. And it was such a vivid scene for me that I will never forget it, only because the describer, in my opinion, in that particular instance, was outstanding. And so audio description, and that's why I'm really sad when there is evidence of laziness in audio description, which we're seeing And I know there have been queries, for instance, where whole elements of scene were left out. And when queried, the audio describer said, well, you didn't need to know that, or you didn't need to be have that described, or, well, why did you need to know that? Which strikes me as incredibly patronizing, which makes me think that there's not enough blind people involved in audio description. One of the outstanding elements of Shazison and the entire way of doing things at Shazison is that the verifiers are blind. In other words, the people auditing the quality are blind, and that's important. And I suspect there are not nearly enough blind people auditing or verifying audio description content in movies these days, which is quite scary because I'm certainly noticing more sloppy audio description in movies, which is rather sad. Let's talk a little about art and images. So 12 years ago, I had the privilege, and once again, Shakila Maharaj is involved here, but Shakila brought out to the country the man who is attributed to being, if not the, certainly the primary founder or developer, or his brainchild was audio description. His name is Joel Snyder. He's an older man now, he's in his 80s. He's a wonderful, wonderful gentleman. And Shakila brought him out, and I hosted him in Cape Town, and we ran workshops, audio description workshops. And part of my job in hosting him was that, I showed him around the town. And I spent one of the most memorable days of my life in Cape Town with Joel Snyder, audio describing various places. And one of the places we went to was the National Gallery. And he described, and he was tireless. I'm very curious and voracious, and I'm a great reader, and I'm constantly asking people what. And I nearly killed the poor old guy, actually, because I was asking, and he was so generous with his time. And so he described for me in the most wonderful detail, pictures and paintings. And so it gave me a great love of, well, I don't have much background in art. My daughter is an artist, and she went to the art school and at UCT at Michaelis. That I'm not knowledgeable, but when it's well described, I love it. So I'm going to show you the picture, and I'm going to describe a picture. So you blindies out there, this is a picture by Titian. The picture is probably a bad way to put it. This is a Renaissance painting by Titian. So Titian was an artist in the 16th century. So he was painting this in the early 1500s. And it's called Venus and Adonis. And by the way, I've heard this audio description. The reason I know this painting so well is because I've actually got a clip of Joel Snyder himself audio describing this very picture. It was very beautiful artwork. So it's an enormous painting, you need to know. It's quite literally 7 feet wide, which is over 2 meters wide and about 1.8 meters high, with great deep frame. So it's a significant size. And it's a woodland scene, and it's of Venus, typically nude. Poor woman, I don't think she's ever worn clothes. I don't think there's a single artwork depicting her wearing nothing but nothing. Anyway, so it's Venus and Adonis. Adonis was a minor hero come demigod, one of Zeus's progeny. And what you're seeing in the picture is a couch, which of course is a little odd in a woodland scene. And there's Venus with her back to us. She's clearly nude. And she's clutching at Adonis, who's kind of wrenching himself away from her. And his tunic, which is pinkish, has been torn open somewhat. And he's a very fit young man. You can see his great big calves. He's barefoot. He's wearing skin trousers. His tunic, as I say, which is a sort of pinkish color, is torn open. He's wearing a quiver on his back with his strap over his chest. He's very powerful. He's got great muscles. He's got curly hair. You can even see a hint of moustache. And he's holding 3 wolfhounds, straining at the leash with his left hand. In his right hand, behind him, you can see a great big 6-foot spear. And Venus is clearly trying to hold him from going somewhere, and he's clearly having none of it and wants to go. And it's interesting, the three dogs, the two of them are really champing at the bit and wanting to go. And one of the dogs, the one closest to us, in fact, has his tail between his legs. And it's interesting because in mythology, this is his last trip, really, his last boar hunt, because he's killed just after the scene by a boar, which possibly is why the dog nearest us has his tail between his legs. But there's more to the picture. In the background, there's mountains. You can actually see Cupid if you look carefully, lunging on a hillside nearby, and there's growing clouds in the mountain in the background. And I just found I can see this picture. I can see this picture, and I've never seen the picture, only because Joel Snyder described it so well. So the next picture I'm not going to show you. I'm going to describe something, and then I'll show you. So forget this picture that you're seeing now on the screen. So the next picture I want to show you is a photograph. I want you to picture Desmond Tutu. And he's standing on Table Mountain. We know it's Table Mountain because in the background, there's the bay and the whole of Table Bay. And you can actually even see on his right side, which is our left, of course, looking at the picture, but on his right side, you can actually see, it's quite hazy, and you can see Robben Island. And he's got his hands behind his back, and he's wearing his red or purple cassock and his great chain of office with the big cross, which would sort of hanging around his heart area. And you can just see his little purple skull cap, and he's wearing his tinted glasses. And he's not doing his usual great big goofy smile that he's well known for, but he's still smiling in a gentler way. But it's significant, this picture, because he's not looking at Robben Island. He's looking exactly 180 degrees away, facing us, which gives us the impression that he's looking forward, not backward. And so let me show you the picture and see if I've done him justice. And so there's Desmond Tutu. So once again, now this was described to me in a museum, and this wasn't described voluntarily. I had to ask the individual, not because she's slack or anything, just that she was not skilled at this. And so I interrogated her. And I asked, 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 and she provided the information. And what that did, of course, was allow me to have a very vivid picture. Once again, I have no difficulty visualizing Desmond Tutu standing on the mountain with the bay at his back. And so, once again, this gives you an idea of how one can apply audio description. This is my favorite area, which is sculpture. And the nice thing about sculpture, my daughter did art at Michaelis, and she majored in sculpture. And I flatter myself that she did it so that she could include her dad in her material, because she could. Had she only painted or drawn, I would have probably got less out of it. But because she was a sculptress, ostensibly, I mean, she's skilled at many medium, but because of the sculpture, I was able to enjoy it often while it was being made. So the first sculpture I want to talk about is my favorite. I say it's my favorite only because I'm quite practical, and I find this to be the most extraordinary sculpture from a purely practical point of view. And it's called Broken Obelisk by Barnett Newman, and it was created in the 60s. And so let me describe it for you. Those of you who can see it, but for those of you who can't, let me tell you about this amazing sculpture. So it's very large. What essentially it is, picture a pyramid. A pyramid has four sides, a pointy, four-sided figure. Like the pyramids in Giza in Egypt, okay? Now, it's the bottom part of the pyramid is about 3.5 meters across, which is a lot, 10 feet, in other words. That's the footprint of it. The pyramid itself is also about the same height, about 10 feet, about 3.5 meters high. Now, at the very pinnacle of the pyramid rests the pointy bit of yet another large structure called an obelisk, which is a very narrow four-sided column, if you like, with a pointy tip. And the pointy tip of the obelisk is quite literally resting on the pointy tip of the pyramid. And the obelisk itself is 15 feet high, which is 5 meters. So now the entire structure is 8 meters high, 25 feet. And the obelisk is now resting on the point to point. And the very edge of the top of the obelisk is broken, which is why it's called broken obelisk. And the join, those 2 points, is about 2 square inches. So it looks incredibly precarious. What he's done, of course, is got a steel rod running right through both pieces so it can't fall over. But it's a very striking sculpture. Given its massive size, you would quite literally crick your neck if you looked up at it, if you were standing near it. And interestingly, this particular one, there are many renditions of the sculpture, by the way, and this one is in Washington State, and it's resting in a reflective pool. So it's got this, you can see reflections and foliage in the background from trees. But there's something about the sculpture which I just can't get enough of. And once again, the reason I can describe it in such technical detail is because of the quality of the audio description, which means I love this sculpture. And hopefully I can put across to you, what it looks like. Then there's another sculpture, which I've just come across, which is in what's called the Sculpture Garden, belonging to Dylan Lewis. Dylan Lewis is one of South Africa's foremost sculptors. And he is well known for his animal themes, often cats, lions, leopards, cheetahs. And this one, my daughter was describing it to me recently, quite literally, about a week ago. And it is the most extraordinary. It's huge for a start. And so obviously one can feel if when it's able to. The trouble is it's quite far into a garden, and I didn't want to kill thousands of rands worth of fynbos clambering near it. And my daughter said to me, don't bother, because it's too big anyway. You simply can't feel it all. So what it is, for those of you who can't see, it's the sculpture of a leopard, one imagines. It doesn't really matter. Many of his sculptures are slightly vague in terms of preciseness, deliberately. He's done it deliberately. So they're quite rough often. And this one, the cat, whatever it is, let's call it a leopard, is leaping up to catch a leaping antelope. So the cat is twisting in his desperation to grab something of the antelope. The antelope, clearly petrified, is leaping high. And so the cat paws are just touching the back legs of the antelope. And the entire sculpture creates something of a circle almost of bronze, where picture if you cup your hands into a C shape, the shape you would hold if you were holding a mug of coffee. That's essentially the curve that both the cat and the antelope create in this extraordinary example of motion. You cannot but imagine motion in the sculpture of this cat desperately trying, twisting in the air and just touching with both paws the one hind foot of the antelope. Of course, we don't know what happens. We don't know whether he grabs the antelope or she grabs the antelope. We don't know if the antelope gets off scot-free. But we're caught in this extraordinary tension. And I don't think I've ever encountered anything quite so staggeringly movement-oriented as the sculpture. Once again, it's useful that the person describing this to me, has a strong background in art. But also I was interrogating a lot to get it. And I think that's really important, is that we mustn't be shy to ask. And if we're not clear, ask some more. Now, So one of the things that I love most is feeling sculptures. And I've been privileged to have been able to feel some rather unusual things. And I've felt many things in several places in the world. I've been to, I've felt up interesting things in Greece and London and America recently and here. And I find the tactile, the ability to feel something is incredibly powerful. And there's a lovely quote by one of my favorite blind authors. She's an academic, a blind academic in America. She's retired, she says, but I can't, I'll believe it when I see it, because she's quite prolific in her writing. And she's well known for having written an incredibly powerful biographic commentary on Helen Keller. It's called Blind Rage. But she's also well known for writing about blind art and blindness and art. And interesting quote, she says, and she knows a lot about art because her parents were both artists. And she says, in my experience, artists are far less precious about their sculptures than the conservators who look after them. What this means really is, what I'm getting at really is, very often we are restricted, and people are restricted from feeling things. And I completely understand why. If everybody touched everything, it would probably end in tears. I get that. But what needs to be understood is that where possible, blind people should be able to touch the things, even if the others can't. And I would put that down to reasonable accommodation. And I saw that about a year ago. My brother, who was also blind, went to the car show. And there's a classic car show in Franschhoek. And he told me that they were absolutely happy for him to go behind the ropes and feel any of the cars when other people weren't able to. And I thought that was very mature. And I was inspired, and I'll be doing the same thing someday when I go to the car show. And so it's a wonderful gift when we are able to appreciate by touch. So this is, those of you who know art would recognize this. So those of you who don't, I've got two pictures here, and they are of a very famous artwork sculpture by Jane Alexander called The Butcher Boys. And they were done in the 80s. And there's a very strong political theme. And what they are is, they are three humanoid figures sitting on a bench. And they are grotesque and actually quite awe-inspiringly ugly and scary, actually. And there's three of these creatures, if you like. They're clearly humanoid, but they've been what's the word, anthropological, because they are horns in all of them. They all have a variety of horns. Also, their facial features have been altered. Their faces, broad noses, have eyes, black marble eyes. They're all white, by the way. This entire thing's made of plaster. And the mouths have been almost welded shut, if you like, or in some way the mouths have been in some way disturbed. And so they don't really have mouths, but they've got almost fused shut. They have no ears, just holes. And they're all sitting. And one of them has his legs crossed with his arms crossed over his legs. The other one has his hands holding the bench, as one does when one sits sometimes. And the other one has his hands resting on his thighs. And there's, in the picture, you'll notice my hand. And this is unusual. I was able to touch this because the curator of the National Gallery, this is, by the way, the picture was taken by Joel Snyder. The curator of the National Gallery was in the audio description workshop given by Joel. And her eyes were opened. And so she let me on the inside of the ropes and allowed me. I spent an hour feeling up the Butcher Boys. And one of the interesting things about this was that I could feel things that you sighted people can't see. There are things in the sculpture you simply can't see. And so I got a very special appreciation of this work, or these works, if you like. And you'll see my hand there is at the back of them. All three of them have their backs flayed. It's almost as if their spinal cord is being ripped out. And I mean, I'm not going to go into the political analysis of what this is. I mean, if you have imagination, you can probably work it out for yourselves. But essentially, all three figures are spineless and their backs are flayed. But I could feel interesting things inside the gap where the spine used to be, which amazed me. And so I really got this extraordinary sculpture only because of the generosity of the National Gallery in allowing me to touch it. Otherwise, I would have had only an academic appreciation from a description, which would have been very difficult because they are so different and so vividly weird. Then there's the tactile experience. I love feeling sculptures. I love feeling everything, and I can't get enough. I'm very tactile, and my hands are good, and I feel stuff. And so this is a wonderful sculpture I discovered in Bloemfontein at the Boer War Museum of a man on horseback. He's clearly going to war. He's got a rifle in his back. He's got a bandolier around his chest. The horse is trotting off, and he's reaching back towards his wife, who's standing there with her baby. And it's essentially a man going to war, in this case, a Boer soldier going off to war. And the Boer War was a very tragic, savage war, where more women and children died than both the Boers and the British soldiers put together, which really makes you think. And so it's very poignant. And the way he's reaching his arm back really made it for me. But I was able to feel most of it. It's more than life size. So, and I know it's more than life size because I got up onto this pedestal, which is about 6 feet up, and then felt around it, and I discovered that the woman with holding the baby was way taller than me. So it's clearly more than life size. But I got enough of the detail by feeling, and then the rest had to be described to me. So there's often a fusion between touching and description. And then when one feels things, there's it's particularly anatomical sculptures, but Dylan Lewis is no different to anyone else here. He other than animals, he does do anatomical features. And so touching sculptures can be a little awkward at times because invariably, and this is not because one is salacious or anything, but if the sculpture is of a woman, as sure as eggs, she has her breasts bared, and you find yourself clutching improbably pneumatic breasts, which only sculptures can do. But I've got this picture where my daughter said, "Listen, Dad, you better hold her waist." So there's a picture of me holding one of Dylan Lewis's sculptures of an angel. We know it's an angel because it has great wings behind, but it's also it's not desperately accurate, it's not anatomically explicitly accurate. So there's a lot of interpretive work going on in the sculpture, but we can feel the wings behind. But I just wanted to demonstrate that, it doesn't mean that we are in any way salacious, that we do find ourselves touching something that we probably wouldn't touch in the normal circumstances if it was an individual standing in front of us, but it can't be helped sometimes. And then when art gets too big to handle, this is the slide saying when art gets too big to handle. And what I'm really talking about here is sometimes no amount of touching will actually help you. So this first one that I'm showing you, the reason I couldn't touch it, or rather that I don't believe somebody could have given me a very accurate description. This is a photograph of it, but in reality, if one was at this place on the site, this is at the Women's Memorial, also at the Anglo-Boer War Museum. And so there's a sculpture on the top of a pedestal, which is 30 feet high. So it's over 10 meters up. And so for one to describe it, if you had a curator or a volunteer or just a friend, they wouldn't be able to really do it justice, I think, to describe it to a blind person. But the reason I can talk about this sculpture intimately was because I had the privilege of feeling the original maquette. And a maquette is a miniature of a sculpture. Sculptors famously do models, small models of their sculptures first, and then they do the big one. And I was able to feel the maquette, which happens to be in the museum. And so because I could feel the maquette, I got a wonderfully intimate introduction to the sculpture, which is in fact huge and out of reach. And what it is, and I want to spend a little time on it. I don't have a great deal of time, so I'm going to move a little bit. What it is two women and a child. And the one woman is seated and the other is standing. And what this is, these are two women that were waiting at Springfontein Station, waiting to go to one of the concentration camps during the Boer War. And the child on the lap of the seated woman is clearly dead or dying. Now, we know a lot about this because this was an actual thing that happened and was witnessed by Emily Hobhouse, who saw these two women who tried to give aid to the child and nothing helped and the child died. And it so moved her that she told the story to the famous Dutch South African sculptor Anton van Wouw. And as a result, he created the sculpture on what she saw. And there's a very moving part of her diary where she describes exactly what this is about. And what you see is the woman who's standing, and she is the most important feature to me, because she's not looking down at her friend and the child. She's looking 90 degrees away. She's looking into the distance, and she's clearly moved to tears. And you can't see the tears, but you can absolutely feel the emotion in the way she's standing, and she's looking into the distance, almost in prayer and in desperation, if you like, but she's just staring into the distance. And there's something extraordinarily powerful by that gaze that she's looking. And then the seated woman, once again, interestingly, isn't looking at her child who's just died in her arms. The child is clearly dead or dying because we see the arm, the left arm of the child is dangling down, the separated fingers, the legs completely limp. And that pathetic arm hanging down from this 3 or 4-year-old child is very moving. And the mother, once again, is just, she didn't cry, apparently, according to Emily. She just stared into the distance. And I find this statue unbelievably poignant and moving. And I'm always fascinated that sculptors can capture emotion as much as this. And once again, had I not been able to feel the maquette of the sculpture, I would never have got this. I don't believe it would have been easy to portray as much as my fingers told me the story. Now, this is another example of when art gets too big to handle and where the tactile ability doesn't, in fact, help you. And there's a wonderful sculpture at Sea Point. And so what I'm showing here is there's two or three pictures of, on the one hand, me feeling a piece of a sculpture. What this is, very cleverly, it's a sculpture made up of 7 or 8 or 6 or 7 pieces. But if you look at it from an angle, from a specific angle, you see the whole thing. And what it is, it's a rhino. And the sculptor ingeniously has created rifle sights, or imagine the crosshairs of a sight. And you look through the sight. And only when you look through the sight do you see the rhino in perspective, taking all 6 or 7 pieces together, which now, because they line up, they make sense. So if you feel one after the other, you can't really perceive what it is. And there's a picture of me there feeling the horn of the rhino, but that's just about all you see in that particular piece. There's little bits of a foot here and a back there and a front and a back and a belly. And so each individual item doesn't mean anything. And this, of course, is fascinating because this is entirely a visual impression. This is 100% visual. And it can only be appreciated by a blind person if it's described. No amount of tactile fiddling will help you here. But it's an incredibly powerful sculpture. Obviously, it's called, very cleverly, it's called rhinosaur, as in dinosaur, which, implying the potential extinction. So it's a very extraordinary piece. And then lastly, This is the sculpture I spoke about right in the beginning when I was walking with my wife and our friend on Sea Point Boulevard, and they said, "Oh, there's a guy climbing on the sunglasses." And I said, "What sunglasses?" And so I demanded to be taken there forthwith, which they did. And then they had to sit there long sufferingly while I clambered. And this gorgeous thing is that you can climb on it. So what it is, it's an enormous pair of sunglasses by an artist called Michael Elian. And I say enormous, so picture the lenses across. That's as wide as a large car. And the arms stretching back are even longer than a car. That gives you an idea. And it's over 2 meters high. And the open lenses, you can stand in them. I think there might even be one of the pictures is of me standing in the open lens. And it's made from brushed stainless steel. And it's smooth to the touch and beautifully welded, exquisitely finished, and incredibly accurate to every detail, even down to a logo, a brand of some description. And the hinges look like they could work if required to do so. Those arms, I suspect, could close and swing shut. And the nicest thing about this is that you're encouraged to climb on it. And there's a picture of me actually climbing on it. The only reason I didn't climb all the way was because it was the middle of the day and the sun was right overhead and it was getting hotter and hotter. I was barefoot. I literally couldn't go any further than you're seeing. You can see me climbing on the arm of the sunglasses. And so this is an example of too big to handle. So yes, you could get it. I suspect you could work out that it's sunglasses if you felt it. But it's most wonderful, playful sculpture to interpret from my point of view. And so to finish, literally, I'm appealing to those of you who can see and those of you who spend time with us that can't, is pay attention. Pay attention, because what you don't tell us, we're simply going to miss. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you, Jeremy. That was superb. Just before we get to questions, Jeremy, there are just a couple of things, and that is that so often we don't really watch things, and we don't really. I often watch a movie, but while I'm watching the movie, I'm doing other things. And Norman watches very attentively. And I think to maybe look at some of these things as if we had to explain it to someone who can't see, it would change the perspective completely. So thank you for the most amazing webinar. Thoroughly enjoyed that. And let's just see what questions there are.
There are quite a few questions and comments. First is from Susan, who says, are you aware the person who did the audio description for all the Light TV series is also blind?
Oh, amazing. That's extraordinary. I wasn't aware of that. No. Amazing. Good show.
And then Charlene says, that was so beautifully described. Desmond Tutu, I saw exactly the photo in my mind's eye when the photo was revealed. So,
cool. Ha, good. So I got it right.
And then an anonymous attendee says, this man has a wonderful voice and speaks so beautifully. I could listen to him talking about anything.
I wish my wife would say that.
And then Katerina says, thank you. Fascinating to listen to your narrative, Jeremy. Can you recommend any other books to read written by a visually impaired person, especially short stories that could be used with teenagers?
Oh, teenagers.
Yes.
Oh, I think Lois Strackham's book would be, I've forgotten his name, Lois, forgive me. I forgot, but yeah, Lois Strackham's book wouldn't hurt. Beautifully written book by a blind person, but I can't think, to tell you the truth. Forgive me, I literally can't Mind you, you know what's always interesting is finding books. Lois and I did this actually in one of her podcasts. We were looking for books where blindness was depicted, and we were comparing how they were depicted, whether they were patronizing or whether they were really well done. And of course, I can't remember a single one of the titles right now. So somebody's welcome. They're welcome to
I can
contact me
find it
later.
quickly. I think there was something called Seeing the Whole Picture, but we would have to look for them.
And then not written by a blind person, but about a blind detective. I know there's a whole series about, I think his name was Max Carradine or something like that. And they're quite interesting in how he solves various crimes based totally on his other senses. I quite enjoyed them. And then Nicolette said, thank you for a very insightful presentation. Are there any apps or AI available to provide audio descriptions of mathematical graphs that learners could use in a classroom?
Wow. That's a great question, you know, and it speaks more to blind education, particularly around the very thorny issue of mathematics, which is appallingly taught now, and it used to be better taught in the old days. So yeah, I don't know, but I'll tell you one guy that might, and it's Elash Mystery. Elash Mystery is a blind, one of the only blind actuaries in the country, and he works at Old Mutual. And I would be very surprised because I seem to recall he had to, in fact, create an app that helped him with formula when he did actuarial science.
Okay.
So that he might be able to help.
Interesting. And then Tracy says, thank you, Jeremy, for your sense of humor and sharing audio descriptions with us in such an interesting way. I've enjoyed the presentation, and Maura also enjoyed it, and Fidoz also. And then Nikhil says, this was a fascinating talk. Your audio description of the images helped me see things I simply didn't notice till you pointed them out. Thank you for helping us see in new ways. And then Lena says, such a brilliant presentation, so interesting, so easy to listen to you. And then lots and lots, Johan, Elisha, and Rinesh. Rinesh has a comment. He says, yes, there's a way to use the AI. So maybe Rinesh can give us more detail about that at some stage. Thank you, Rinesh. And that's the end of the questions and comments.
Good.
That was absolutely fabulous. And we generally share the webinars widely, but I think that this should be shared to so many people, because I think that for many of us, as we were talking earlier, we grew up before TV in South Africa, which was brought in 1976. And we listened to stories and we listened to the radio, and we really learned to imagine things. Whereas today, children are taught in a very visual way, and it's very, very different. And that is really important for us to try and get across to children how they need to use their imagination more. And I'm sure that if they had to scan your brain, that the visual part of your brain, the visual memory, would be very active, because you use your brain so efficiently to understand things. So that was absolutely amazing. Thank you very much. And the next webinar will only be on about the 17th of July. So while you are waiting for those webinars, you can go onto our website and you can do CPD for the recorded webinars and catch up on your CPD. So thank you very much, everybody, and have a pleasant evening. Bye,
Thank you
Jerry.
very much.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Go
Cora.
well. Bye.
Bye-bye.